The streets of New York City never stopped moving. Bright lights, honking taxis, pedestrians weaving through the chaos. It was the kind of city that swallowed people whole, drowning out voices that weren't loud enough to be heard. And Sergeant Rebecca "Becky" Lawson had stopped trying to be heard a long time ago. She sat near the entrance of a subway station, the cold pavement seeping through the worn fabric of her jeans. A frayed army jacket, patches faded, wrapped tightly around her shoulders. A weak shield against the biting autumn wind. People passed her by without a second glance, their expensive coats and hurried steps telling her everything she already knew. She was invisible to them. She wasn't the kind of homeless person who begged. She had pride, even if life had beaten it down. She didn't hold a sign, didn't call out for spare change. She just sat there, staring at the sidewalk, her mind lost in memories of deserts and gunfire, of soldiers calling her name in the heat of battle. She had been someone once, a combat medic in Afghanistan, running toward the wounded while others ran for cover. She had saved lives. She had mattered. Now, she wasn't sure anymore. The sound of squealing tires and flashing cameras jolted her from her thoughts. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. A black SUV pulled up across the street, a convoy of sleek armored vehicles surrounding it. The doors opened, and the energy around the hotel entrance shifted instantly. Rebecca looked up, her eyes narrowing as she recognized the man stepping out. Donald J. Trump. Even if she had spent years avoiding the news, it was impossible not to know who he was. Former president, billionaire, controversial, loud. And now, just a few feet away from her, the scene unfolded like something out of a movie. The crowd reacted, cheers, protests, flashing cameras. He waved, shook hands, exchanged words with a few attendees as he made his way toward the entrance of the luxury hotel, where a charity gala was taking place. Rebecca expected him to disappear inside, but then he stopped. Right in the middle of the sidewalk, just before stepping through the grand doors, Trump's gaze flickered toward her. She froze. His security detail tensed immediately, their eyes darting toward her, assessing her as a potential threat. But Trump wasn't looking at them. He was looking at her, at the patch on her sleeve, at the military boots on her feet, still caked with years of dirt and wear. For the first time in a long time, someone was actually seeing her. She expected him to move on, to wave, to smile, to walk into that ballroom where the elite of the world waited for him. Instead, he changed direction and walked straight toward her. The air seemed to tighten, the noise of the crowd muffling. Rebecca's grip on her jacket tightened as she forced herself to meet his eyes. And then, to her utter shock, Trump spoke. "You served?" His voice was steady, cutting through the chaos like a blade. For a moment, she didn't know how to answer. It had been so long since anyone had asked her that, so long since anyone had cared. She cleared her throat, her voice rough from years of silence. "Yeah, Army. Combat medic." Trump's eyes flickered, something shifting in his expression, something serious. He nodded. "That's good. That's real good." One of his aides stepped up, whispering urgently, "Sir, we need to keep moving." Trump waved them off. "Not now." Then, to everyone's shock, he turned back to Rebecca. "You eaten today?" She blinked. "What? You hungry?" he repeated, his voice firm, like it wasn't a question, just a fact that needed to be addressed. She hesitated. Come on," he said, gesturing toward the hotel entrance. "Let's get you something to eat." The security team immediately stiffened. "Sir, we can't just—" "She served her country," Trump interrupted, his tone unshakable. "She's coming inside." Rebecca's breath caught. She had spent years being ignored, being shoved aside, forgotten. Now, one of the most powerful men in the world was offering her a seat at his table. She swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on her, and then she stood up. The crowd gasped. Cameras clicked wildly as Trump and Rebecca walked side by side toward the golden doors of the luxury hotel. And as she stepped inside, past the velvet ropes, past the wide eyes of society's richest and most powerful, she realized something. She wasn't invisible anymore. The golden doors of the five-star hotel closed behind Rebecca. shutting out the cold and the endless rush of the city. The sudden warmth hit her like a wave, a stark contrast to the streets she had called home for far too long. The scent of expensive cologne, fresh-cut flowers, and gourmet food lingered in the air, a world she had long been locked out of. Her boots scuffed against the polished marble floors, each step feeling like a mistake, like she was trespassing in a place where she didn't belong. The room was massive, crystal chandeliers, towering floral centerpieces, gold-trimmed tables lined with polished silverware. Hundreds of guests dressed in tuxedos and designer gowns sipped champagne, their conversations laced with laughter and easy confidence. And now, standing among them, was her. A homeless woman, wrapped in an old army jacket with holes at the seams, her hair unkempt, her face weathered from years of struggling. The air shifted as more people noticed her presence. A woman in a navy blue cocktail dress nudged her husband, whispering behind a manicured hand. A group of young entrepreneurs at the bar paused mid-drink, their eyes darting toward her, then toward Trump, as if waiting for an explanation. Even the waitstaff hesitated. Trump either didn't notice or didn't care. He strode forward with the confidence of a man who owned the room, which, in a way, he did. Rebecca forced herself to keep moving, matching his pace, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. One of his aides rushed to his side, his voice low and urgent. "Sir, the press is already buzzing. This is going to be a headline in less than 10 minutes. Trump didn't break stride. Let them write whatever they want. Rebecca's throat tightened. She wasn't used to this, being noticed, being seen, especially not like this. She could already hear the headlines forming. Trump brings homeless woman to gala, PR stunt, or genuine act. Billionaire's unexpected guest shocks high society. Her instinct screamed at her to turn around, walk out, disappear back into the city where no one cared enough to judge her. But then Trump looked at her. And for the first time in years, someone wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her like she belonged. They reached the main dining area, where a long, elegantly set table stretched across the ballroom. The plates gleamed under the soft lighting, filled with gourmet dishes that Rebecca didn't even recognize. Trump gestured to an empty chair beside him. "Sit." Rebecca hesitated. "Sir, Sit," he repeated, pulling out the chair himself. "You served your country. You deserve to sit at this table." Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered herself onto the velvet cushion. She felt wildly out of place, her body tense with the weight of 100 stares pressing into her. A waiter appeared at her side almost instantly, his expression carefully neutral. "Would you care for some wine, ma'am?" "Ma'am?" It had been years since anyone had called her that. She glanced at Trump, who smirked. "Do I look like I drink wine?" Trump chuckled. "Bring her a steak, medium rare, and a Coke." The waiter nodded and disappeared, leaving her speechless. The guests were still whispering. The event had been planned down to the last detail. An exclusive charity gala for the ultra-wealthy to discuss economic policies, investments, and tax incentives. Not this. Not a homeless veteran taking a seat at the table. Across from her, a man in a black suit, probably some CEO or investor, leaned forward, his expression cautious but curious. "Mr. Trump, if I may ask, who is your guest?" Trump wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and leaned back in his chair. "This is Sergeant Rebecca Lawson, Army combat medic, served multiple tours overseas, saved more lives than anyone in this room." He took a sip of water before adding, "And she's been living on the streets while half of you sip champagne and talk about helping veterans." Silence. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others avoided her gaze altogether. Rebecca felt every second of it. A man at the far end of the table cleared his throat. "Well, we do donate to veteran charities." Trump scoffed. "Oh yeah? How many homeless vets have you invited to dinner?" The man opened his mouth, then closed it. Rebecca wanted to disappear, but something in Trump's words made her sit up just a little bit straighter. The whispers in the room grew louder. The press had definitely caught wind of what was happening. Cameras flashed from the entrance, journalists huddled near the back of the ballroom, their lenses capturing every single second of the most unexpected moment of the night. And then, before Rebecca could process anything, Trump turned to her and spoke again. "You said you were a medic?" She nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir." How many lives did you save? Her fingers tightened around the napkin in her lap. I don't know. Trump nodded. You never counted, did you? She shook her head. Wasn't about the numbers. He smirked. Exactly. Then, turning back to the table, he added, That's the difference between people like her and people like us. She never counted because it wasn't about her, and yet she's the one sleeping on a sidewalk while half the people in this country argue about what to do with taxpayer money. A few people looked away, uncomfortable, but some actually looked ashamed. Rebecca watched, stunned, as the dynamic in the room shifted. Some of the most powerful people in the country were now paying attention to something they had ignored for years. And it had nothing to do with statistics or policies. It had everything to do with her. Trump looked at her again, more serious this time. You want a job? She blinked. What? A job, housing, a fresh start. You want it? Her throat tightened. Yes. Good, he said, flagging down one of his aides. Because starting tomorrow, you're not sleeping on the streets anymore. Rebecca felt the weight of everything crashing down on her at once. The months of hunger, the cold nights, the loneliness, the feeling of being forgotten. And now, here she was, at a table she never thought she'd sit at, with an offer she never thought she'd get. For the first time in years, she felt something other than exhaustion. She felt hope, and as she picked up the glass of ice-cold Coke that the waiter had just placed in front of her, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Rebecca could still feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, the stares like needles against her skin. She had spent years being ignored, dismissed, overlooked like she was just another piece of the city's clutter. Now, in the span of minutes, she was at the center of it all. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the cold glass of Coke to her lips. The carbonation burned in the best way, a reminder that this moment was real, that she wasn't dreaming or hallucinating from hunger. Across from her, a billionaire in a tuxedo adjusted his cufflinks, stealing occasional glances at her like she was some strange new species he was trying to understand. To her left, a woman with diamond earrings so large they could probably pay rent for a year, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She wasn't supposed to be here. At least, that's what these people thought. But Trump? He wasn't looking at her like she didn't belong. He was acting like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The waiter returned, setting a plate in front of her, a perfectly cooked steak, roasted potatoes, steamed vegetables. Rebecca felt her stomach clench. She hadn't had a real meal in, she didn't even know how long. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the fork. Years of surviving on scraps, digging through dumpsters when it got bad enough, had made it almost impossible to just sit down and eat like a normal person. Trump noticed. Eat, he said simply. Rebecca swallowed hard, forcing her hands to stop shaking as she cut into the steak. The first bite nearly undid her. The taste, the warmth, the feeling of having something real in her stomach. It was overwhelming. Across the table, a man in his 60s, his face lined with years of privilege and boardroom decisions, finally spoke. Mr. Trump, I must say, this is quite the spectacle. Trump didn't even look up. You think helping a veteran is a spectacle? The man hesitated. That's not what I meant. It's just unexpected. Trump set down his silverware and leaned back in his chair. What's unexpected is that she is sitting here eating her first real meal in God knows how long, while half the people in this room talk about helping veterans over hors d'oeuvres. The man opened his mouth, then shut it again. A few others at the table looked away, shifting in their seats, uncomfortable in a way they should have been years ago. Rebecca kept eating, trying to pretend like she wasn't hearing every word, but she was, and something inside her, something long buried under exhaustion and hopelessness, started to stir. She had been angry before, angry at the world, at the system, at herself. But this was different. Trump wasn't sugarcoating anything. He wasn't handing her a scripted speech about how much we care about our veterans while sipping champagne. He was calling these people out, right to their faces, and they had no idea how to handle it. A woman with sleek blonde hair and a voice that sounded like she had never worked a day in her life cleared her throat. Well, of course, we care about veterans. Many of us here donate to veteran charities. Trump scoffed. Yeah? How many homeless vets have you actually met? Silence. Rebecca glanced around the table, watching as these so-called philanthropists struggled to answer a simple question. Trump smirked. That's what I thought? The air in the ballroom had changed completely. The energy of the night was no longer about high society networking and polished PR moments. It was about her, a woman who had once pulled dying soldiers out of burning vehicles in the middle of war zones, but now had to fight for a place to sleep every night. For the first time in years, Rebecca felt something shift. She wasn't just a shadow in the city. She wasn't just a statistic. She was someone they had to look at. Trump turned to her, his voice lowering just slightly. You ever think about getting back on your feet? Rebecca blinked. The question hit her harder than she expected. Of course she had thought about it, but thinking about it and believing it was possible were two entirely different things. She hesitated. It's not that simple. Trump nodded like he understood. Nothing worth doing ever is. She felt the words settle into her chest. You have skills, he continued. You were a medic, right? Rebecca nodded. Yes, sir, combat medic. You saved lives? Her throat tightened. Yes, sir. Then why the hell are you sleeping on a sidewalk? The words landed like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth, but she had no answer. Not one that didn't sound like an excuse. Trump waved over one of his aides, a sharp-looking man in a dark suit. I want you to set her up with a place, find her work, whatever it takes. She's not spending another night on the street. Rebecca's breath hitched. One of the guests at the table, a businessman with a face made for political campaigns, chuckled. You can't just fix a problem like veteran homelessness with one good deed. Trump looked at him like he was an idiot. Maybe not, but I can fix this one. Right now? The businessman had nothing to say to that. Rebecca's hands clenched into fists under the table. For years, she had been trapped in a cycle of hopelessness, convinced that no one saw her, that no one cared. And now, in a single night, everything had changed, because someone had finally stopped. Someone had finally looked her in the eye and dared to ask why she was being left behind. For the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way back. The weight of everything, her past, her struggles, the crushing loneliness, threatened to break her right then and there. But instead of falling apart, she sat up straighter, because something told her this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. The meal was over, but the impact of what had just happened was still rippling through the room. Conversations, once fluid and carefree, had shifted to hushed whispers. Some of the high-profile guests at the table avoided eye contact. Others stole curious glances at Rebecca, unsure whether to acknowledge her or pretend she didn't exist. Trump remained unfazed, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin before tossing it onto the table. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket, and looked down at his aide. Make the calls. I want her set up with housing by the end of the night. The aide nodded immediately, already typing something into his phone. Rebecca sat there, stunned into silence. She wasn't sure if this was really happening or if the exhaustion and hunger were making her hallucinate. One moment, she had been just another ghost on the streets, another invisible veteran trying to survive the day. Now, she was sitting in a 5-star hotel, listening to one of the most powerful men in the world make plans to completely change her life. Her throat was dry. She needed to say something. Why are you doing this? Her own voice felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone else. Trump turned to her, his expression unreadable. Because it's the right thing to do. Rebecca studied him, searching for some trace of an ulterior motive, some reason beyond the obvious. She wasn't naive. She knew people didn't just help without expecting something in return. She had been a combat medic. She had been trained to spot lies, weakness, hesitation. But when she looked into his eyes, she didn't see any of those things, only certainty. She swallowed hard, unsure of how to process what was happening. The businessman from earlier, the one who had tried to challenge Trump before, finally spoke up. This is all very inspiring, Mr. Trump, but one person off the streets doesn't fix the bigger problem. Trump turned to him, his eyes sharp. And sitting around talking about it over champagne does? The businessman fell silent. Trump smirked. That's what I thought. Rebecca exhaled, the tension in her chest loosening slightly. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but she knew one thing for certain. She had never had anyone fight for her like this. The weight of it all was too much. The kindness, the unexpected shift in her reality. She had spent years building up walls, telling herself that no one cared, that she was on her own. And now she was standing at the edge of something new, something she had been too afraid to believe in for a long time. Hope. She clenched her hands into fists beneath the table, grounding herself. "You really think it's that simple?" she asked, her voice softer now, but still carrying the weight of her years of struggle. Trump met her gaze, and for the first time, his expression softened just a little. "No," he admitted, "but simple or not, it's still worth doing." Something inside her cracked, a piece of the anger, the bitterness, the resentment that had been her armor for years. It chipped away. Before she could respond, the hotel's event manager approached the table, clearing his throat. He looked uneasy, his hands clasped in front of him, like a man about to deliver bad news. "Mr. Trump, I need to inform you that there are reporters waiting outside. They've caught wind of this and—" Trump waved a hand, cutting him off. "Let them wait." The manager hesitated, then nodded, retreating into the background. Rebecca exhaled, shaking her head in disbelief. "You really don't care, do you?" Trump smirked. "Not even a little." For the first time that night, she laughed. It was small, barely a chuckle, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. The weight of years spent fighting just to survive wasn't gone, but it was lighter now. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. She wasn't sure if this would last, or if she would wake up tomorrow back on the cold pavement, just another forgotten veteran in a city that moved too fast to care. But right now, she was full, warm, and seen. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Rebecca stepped out of the hotel and into the cold night air, the rush of the city hitting her all at once. The moment the golden doors swung open, the flash of cameras erupted, reporters crowding the entrance like vultures sensing fresh news. Questions were being shouted over each other, microphones thrust forward, desperate to capture the story that had unfolded inside that ballroom. "Mr. Trump, can you comment on what just happened? Is this a publicity stunt or a genuine act of charity? Sergeant Lawson, how does it feel to have the former president step in to help you?" Rebecca flinched at the onslaught of voices, the flashing lights feeling like gunfire in the middle of a chaotic battlefield. She had spent years trying to disappear, blending into the background, becoming part of the city's unseen population. Now, all of a sudden, she was the center of attention. Trump stepped forward, his presence commanding the space with ease. "You want a headline?" he asked, his voice booming over the crowd. "Here's your headline. We take care of our veterans. She served this country. She saved lives, and she deserves better than the streets." The cameras continued snapping, the questions still pouring in, but Rebecca barely heard them anymore. She felt light, weightless, as if the burden of all those years of survival was suddenly shared, no longer crushing her under its weight. One of Trump's aides appeared at her side, a well-dressed man with an earpiece and a professional yet unreadable expression. "Ms. Lawson, we've secured a place for you at a nearby hotel for tonight, and we're arranging long-term housing options. We also have contacts with veteran employment programs that can assist you with work." The words hit her harder than she expected. Housing, a job, a real chance. She had dreamed of hearing those words before, but after years of being brushed aside by overworked shelters and underfunded programs, she had stopped believing in them. "Why?" she asked, looking up at Trump. Her voice was quiet, almost drowned out by the noise around them. Trump met her gaze, and this time there was no smirk, no bravado, just conviction. "Because you earned it." Rebecca swallowed hard. A part of her wanted to question it, to doubt it, to push it away because it felt too good to be real. But another part of her, the part that had survived against all odds, told her to take this moment and hold on to it with everything she had. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Good," Trump said, patting her on the shoulder before turning back to the cameras. "Now, if you people really care about helping veterans, maybe stop asking dumb questions and start writing about the real problem. Why so many of them are out here in the first place." The reporters hesitated, some looking uncomfortable, others furiously scribbling in their notepads. Rebecca had no more words to give them, no clever sound bites, no perfectly packaged story for the news cycle. But as she stood there, the cold no longer biting at her skin, the weight of the night finally settling in, she realized she didn't need to say anything. She had already proven she existed, and for the first time in a long time, she believed that tomorrow would be different. 1 month later. Rebecca adjusted the sleeves of her new uniform, standing in front of a mirror in a small but clean hotel room. She was working now, a medical assistant at a veterans clinic, helping those who had walked the same hard road she had. She wasn't healed, not completely. Some wounds didn't fade overnight, but she was moving forward. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a private number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello? Rebecca, it's Trump." She froze. "How's it going?" he asked casually, as if they had been lifelong friends. She exhaled a soft laugh, shaking her head. "It's good, really good." "Good, you keep moving forward," Trump said. "And if anyone gives you trouble, tell them you've got friends in high places." Rebecca smirked. "I think I can handle myself." "Yeah, I think you can too," Trump said, chuckling. "Take care, Sergeant." The call ended, and Rebecca sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone. The city outside was still the same. The world hadn't changed overnight, but she had. And for the first time in a long time, maybe the first time ever, she wasn't just surviving, she was living, and that was everything.